The Adriatic Sea, 1050 AD. A merchant galley moves through shallow lagoon water toward a city that should not exist. There is no stone foundation here, no solid ground, no natural harbor. There is only a cluster of mud islands rising barely above the tidal line, connected by bridges and canals, surrounded by water on every side. By every rational principle of city planning, this place is impossible. Cities are built on land. They require agriculture, fresh water, defensible ground. This city has none of those things. What it has is salt, not just any salt, not the modest deposits that every coastal community scrapes from tidal pools and sells locally. Venice controls salt on a scale that no other entity in medieval Europe approaches. Salt from the Adriatic lagoons, salt from the Aegean islands, salt from the North African coast, salt from Cyprus and Crete. It buys salt where it is cheap, moves it to where it is needed, and sells it at prices that reflect not the cost of production but the absolute necessity of the buyer. Because everyone needs salt. In a world without refrigeration, without chemical preservatives, without any method of keeping food through winter other than preservation in brine or dry salt, the commodity that Venice controls is not a luxury. It is the difference between eating in January and starving. What Venice builds from this foundation is not simply a trading empire. It is a system of commercial dominance so complete, so carefully maintained, and so ruthlessly enforced that the cities and kingdoms of medieval Europe do not merely buy from Venice. They depend on it in ways that give Venice the ability to make political decisions through commercial leverage rather than military force. Salt is how Venice becomes Venice, and almost nobody knows it. Venice is founded, according to its own tradition, when refugees from the Roman city of Aquileia flee onto the lagoon islands to escape Attila, the Hun, in 452 AD. Whether the foundation story is precisely true or legendary embellishment, the geography is real. A group of islands in a shallow lagoon at the northern end of the Adriatic, separated from the mainland by water, shallow enough to make cavalry attack impossible and deep enough to allow merchant ships to navigate. The lagoon itself produces salt. The tidal flats around the islands trap seawater that the summer sun evaporates, leaving behind crystalline salt that requires minimal processing. The earliest Venetians harvest it. Their neighbors on the mainland need it. A trade begins that is at first local and modest, lagoon salt exchanged for mainland grain and timber, but which establishes the commercial habit that will define Venice for 1,000 years. By the 9th century, Venice is doing something more sophisticated than local salt exchange. It has negotiated with the Byzantine Empire, which claims nominal sovereignty over the Adriatic, a series of trading privileges that give Venetian merchants extraordinary access to Byzantine markets. The Venetians are useful to Byzantium as a naval auxiliary force, helping suppress piracy in the Adriatic, and Byzantium pays for this service in commercial concessions rather than gold. The concessions allow Venetian merchants to operate in Byzantine ports with lower tariffs than any competitor. The salt trade is the foundation of these Byzantine relationships. Venice brings Adriatic salt to Constantinople and the Eastern Mediterranean, where local production is insufficient to meet demand. It brings back spices, silk, and luxury goods from the East. The salt funds the Eastern trade. The Eastern trade makes Venice rich. The wealth funds the galleys that enforce Venice's commercial privileges. The structure is self-reinforcing from its first iteration. But salt is more than the foundation of the Eastern trade. Salt is, in Venice's commercial strategy, a political instrument, the most powerful one available to a city that cannot project military force across the continent, but can project commercial leverage wherever food preservation is a matter of survival. The Venetian salt monopoly does not announce itself. It accumulates over 2 centuries through a combination of strategic investment, commercial suppression of competitors, and the patient acquisition of production sources that no rival can access. The mechanism is consistent across every application. Venice identifies a salt-producing region, the Adriatic coast, the Aegean islands, the North African shore. It negotiates or purchases exclusive access to that production. It then suppresses local trade by requiring that all salt moving through its commercial network, the network that also carries the spices, silks, and manufactured goods that every European merchant needs, passes through Venice and carries the Venetian markup. Merchants who try to source salt independently find that their access to other Venetian-controlled goods is suddenly restricted, their ships inspected more carefully in Venetian-administered ports, their commercial relationships with Venetian banking houses complicated in ways that are never explicitly punitive but are persistently inconvenient. The coercion is commercial rather than military, but it is coercion nonetheless. Venice does not need to send soldiers to enforce its salt monopoly. It needs only to make the alternative to buying Venetian salt sufficiently expensive and sufficiently uncertain that rational merchants conclude that compliance is cheaper than resistance. The salt statutes, the formal legal framework of the Venetian Salt Administration, are among the most detailed commercial legislation produced in medieval Europe. They specify which cities may purchase salt and in what quantities, which merchants may handle it, what prices may be charged at each stage of distribution, and what penalties apply to violations. The office responsible for administering them, the Salt Magistracy, established formally in 1281 but operating informally long before, is one of the most powerful bureaucratic institutions in Venice. Its revenues flow directly into the state treasury. Its decisions determine the commercial life of cities hundreds of miles from the lagoon. The salt magistrates are not simply administrators, they are strategists. When Venice wants to pressure a rival city, Ferrara, Bologna, the Este Lords of the Po Valley, the salt magistracy adjusts the terms on which that city receives its salt. When Venice wants to reward a commercial partner, salt flows to them at preferential rates. When Venice negotiates with a regional power, the salt allocation is among the first items on the table, because everyone who sits across from the Venetian negotiators understands that their city's ability to preserve food through winter is, in a real and practical sense, in Venetian hands. To understand the leverage Venice holds, it is necessary to understand what salt means in a world without refrigeration. Every fishing community on the Atlantic coast of Europe, the cod fishermen of the North Sea, the herring fleets of the Baltic, the sardine boats of Portugal, needs salt to make its catch commercially viable. Fresh fish spoils within days. Salt cod survives for months. The difference between a fishing industry that feeds a region and a fishing industry that feeds a continent is salt. Without it, the fish is local and perishable. With it, the fish is a traded commodity that moves inland along river routes, feeds populations far from the sea, and generates the revenues that fund the fishing fleets. Every farming community in Europe needs salt to preserve meat through the winter. The pig slaughtered in November must last until April. Salt is how it lasts. The salted pork, the salt-cured ham, the pickled herring and brine, these are not delicacies. They are the primary protein source of the European peasantry through the 4 months when nothing grows and nothing fresh can be slaughtered sustainably. A community without adequate salt in November is a community facing hunger in February. The cheese-making industries of France, the Low Countries, and England depend on salt for the curing process that turns fresh milk into a storable commodity. The leather-working industries that produce boots, saddles, harnesses, and the 1,000 leather goods that medieval life requires depend on salt in the tanning process. The dyeing trades that produce the colored cloth of the great textile cities use salt compounds in the fixing process. Salt is not a luxury commodity with an elastic demand. It is a necessity with a demand that barely changes regardless of price, because the alternatives to having it are hunger, spoilage, and the collapse of the preservation economy that underlies everything else. This is the foundation of Venetian power. Venice does not control a product that people want. It controls a product that people cannot function without. The difference in commercial leverage is absolute. 1482 AD is outside the formal period of this story, but the War of Ferrara, also called the Salt War, is the most explicit demonstration of what Venice's salt monopoly means as a political weapon, and it illuminates the structure that has been building for 4 centuries. The Este Lords of Ferrara control the Po Delta, where significant salt production has been developing independently of Venetian control. This independent production threatens the monopoly, not because it can supply all of Europe, but because it creates an alternative, a source of salt that does not require Venetian approval, Venetian pricing, or Venetian political compliance. Venice cannot permit an alternative to exist. An alternative, once established, becomes a precedent. A precedent becomes a competing network. A competing network dismantles the monopoly that is the foundation of Venetian commercial power. Venice goes to war. Not immediately. First, it applies commercial pressure, restricts the Ferrarese salt from reaching its markets, maneuvers diplomatically to isolate the Este from their allies. When the commercial pressure proves insufficient, the Venetian fleet moves up the Po. The war is short, expensive for both sides, and produces a treaty that formally limits Ferrarese salt production. Venice wins not by destroying Ferrara, but by re-establishing the commercial boundaries that the Ferrarese salt production had challenged. The war's significance is not the military campaign. It is the demonstration that Venice will use military force to defend a commercial monopoly, that salt is not simply a commodity, but a strategic asset whose control is worth fighting for explicitly. Every city in northern Italy watches the War of Ferrara and draws the appropriate conclusion about the costs of challenging Venetian commercial authority. The salt monopoly is the foundation, but Venice builds on it with a sophistication that transforms a commodity advantage into a continental commercial system. The Venetian arsenal, the state shipyard that becomes, by the 14th century, the largest industrial facility in the world, employing 16,000 workers at its peak, is funded in significant part by salt revenues. The arsenal produces the galleys that carry Venetian commerce across the Mediterranean, that enforce Venetian trading rights in Adriatic ports, and that give Venice the military commercial projection capability that its small physical size would otherwise make impossible. Salt money builds the ships that protect the salt trade that generates the salt money. The Venetian banking system, among the earliest and most sophisticated in medieval Europe, develops in direct relationship with the salt trade. Merchants who buy salt from Venice on credit create debt instruments that circulate as a form of early commercial paper. The salt magistracy's revenues back state bonds, the prestiti, that Venice issues to finance military and commercial operations. The bond market, the banking system, and the salt administration are interconnected in ways that make the entire Venetian commercial economy a single integrated machine with salt at its metabolic center. The Fondaco dei Tedeschi, the German trading house in Venice where merchants from the Holy Roman Empire conduct their business, exists because German merchants need Venetian salt and Venetian luxury goods simultaneously. The German trade brings silver south. The silver funds salt purchases and Eastern trade. The Eastern trade brings spices and silk north through Venice to the German market. Venice sits at the center of this circulation not by accident but by deliberate construction of a geographic and commercial position that makes bypassing it more expensive than using it. The overland salt routes into the interior of Europe are administered through a system of licensed distributors, merchants in Verona, Milan, Florence, and Bologna, who hold Venetian salt licenses and are therefore simultaneously commercial partners and political clients. Their businesses depend on Venetian goodwill. Their city's food security depends on Venetian allocation decisions. The web of dependency runs from the lagoon to the Alps and beyond, creating a political influence that no army of comparable cost could purchase. Venice does not hold its salt monopoly unopposed. The history of medieval European commerce is partly the history of attempts to find, develop, and protect alternative salt sources that might reduce or eliminate Venetian leverage. The Atlantic salt produced at Bourgneuf on the French coast, the Bay of Biscay salt that the Hanseatic League ships north to the Baltic, is Venice's most significant structural competitor during the 13th and 14th centuries. Bourgneuf salt is lower quality than Mediterranean salt, too coarse and mineral-laden for the most demanding preservation uses, but it is abundant, cheap, and not Venetian. The Hanseatic merchants who build their trade on Baltic herring and North Sea cod develop their own salt supply chains specifically to avoid dependence on the Mediterranean monopoly. This Hanseatic salt network is the reason Venice's monopoly never becomes absolute. The northern European salt trade operates largely outside Venetian reach. The geography of the Baltic and North Sea is too far from the Adriatic for Venetian commercial pressure to be applied effectively. Venice dominates the Mediterranean and the Central European market. It does not dominate the north, but the boundary between these zones is itself a commercial battlefield. The cities of the Rhine Valley, the Low Countries, and northern France are contested markets where Venetian Mediterranean salt and Hanseatic Atlantic salt compete for dominance. Venice uses its luxury goods network, the spices and silks that only it can supply, to bundle commercial relationships in ways that favor Venetian salt even in markets where Atlantic salt is geographically closer. The merchant who wants pepper has to deal with Venice. The merchant who deals with Venice finds that Venetian salt is conveniently available at competitive prices. The bundling is not coercive in any single transaction. Across thousands of transactions, it is structurally determinative. The inland distribution of Venetian salt creates infrastructure, roads, river routes, weighing stations, storage facilities, that becomes the physical skeleton of northern Italian commercial geography. The cities that grow along the salt routes grow because salt moves through them. The cities that control the weighing stations and the storage facilities extract revenues from every transaction. The political geography of northern Italy in the medieval period is shaped in significant part by the economics of salt distribution. Servia, on the Adriatic coast south of Venice, is a city that exists almost entirely because of salt. Its salt pans produce some of the finest salt in the Adriatic, prized for cheesemaking and fish curing for its mineral purity. Venice acquires control of Servia's production in the 12th century and administers it as a component of the broader monopoly system. Servia is not destroyed by Venetian control. It continues to produce, and its workers continue to work. But the revenues from that production flow to Venice, and the commercial decisions about where that salt goes and at what price are made in the lagoon, not on the Adriatic shore, where the evaporation pans sit. Chioggia, at the southern end of the Venetian lagoon, is the other great Adriatic salt producer, and its relationship with Venice is the most explicit demonstration of how the monopoly enforces itself domestically. Chioggia has its own salt production, its own merchant families, and its own commercial ambitions. Venice absorbs it, not by conquest but by commercial subordination, requiring Chioggia's salt to be sold through Venetian distribution channels at Venetian-administered prices. When Chioggia resists, Venice applies pressure that is commercial first and military when necessary. The War of Chioggia in 1378 is fought against Genoa, partly over control of Adriatic salt routes. Chioggia is devastated in the fighting. After the war, it never seriously challenges Venetian commercial authority again. The revenues from the salt monopoly do not simply enrich Venetian merchants. They fund a state apparatus whose capacity exceeds that of any comparable medieval polity. Venice in 1300 has a population of roughly 100,000. A major city by medieval standards, but not exceptional. Its tax revenues, however, are exceptional because they include the proceeds of the salt monopoly, the customs duties on the trade that the salt network sustains, and the interest on the state bonds that the salt revenues backstop. These revenues fund a professional diplomatic corps. Venice maintains permanent ambassadors in the courts of every significant European power and in Constantinople, a practice that is effectively unique in medieval Europe and that gives Venice an informational and diplomatic advantage that compounds over time. They fund the arsenal's shipbuilding capacity. They fund the Venetian navy that patrols the Adriatic and enforces trading rights across the eastern Mediterranean. They fund the system of colonial administration, the podesta system through which Venice governs Crete, Corfu, and its other Aegean possessions, that extends Venetian commercial reach without requiring the kind of territorial conquest and military occupation that mainland empires depend on. Venice is, in the fullest sense, a commercial state, an entity whose entire political structure is organized around the maintenance and exploitation of commercial advantage. The salt monopoly is not incidental to this structure. It is the first and most fundamental layer of it, the original source of the revenues and the commercial habits that everything else is built on top of. The Doge who governs Venice is elected by a council of merchant nobles. The decisions of that council are shaped at every point by commercial calculation. Wars are entered and exited on the basis of cost-benefit analysis. Alliances are formed and broken according to trade route logic. The famous Venetian pragmatism, the willingness to deal with Muslims, with the Byzantine schismatics, with any power regardless of religion or ideology, if the commercial terms are acceptable, is not moral flexibility. It is the logical extension of a state whose purpose is commerce, and whose instrument is the control of things other people cannot do without. Salt is the first of those things. It is not the last. But without the salt, there is no Venice to build the rest on. The salt monopoly does not end dramatically. It dissolves over the 15th and 16th centuries as the forces that have been accumulating against it reach critical mass simultaneously. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 closes the eastern trade routes that have made Venice the indispensable middleman between Europe and Asia. The Portuguese rounding of Africa in 1488 and Vasco da Gama's arrival in India in 1498 open an Atlantic route to Asian goods that bypasses the Mediterranean entirely. The spice trade that has flowed through Venice for 2 centuries begins to flow around it. The commercial network that the salt monopoly has anchored begins to lose the connections that made it structural rather than optional. Atlantic salt from Portugal and France becomes more competitive as Atlantic trade volumes grow and the ships carrying it become more efficient. The Hanseatic salt network expands into markets that Venetian commercial pressure can no longer effectively contest. The German merchants who had accepted Venetian terms because Venice controlled both salt and spices now have alternatives for both. Venice does not collapse. It remains a significant commercial and artistic center well into the 17th century. Its salt administration continues operating. But the monopoly, the ability to hold European food security hostage to Venetian commercial decisions, is gone. The leverage that had built the arsenal, funded the diplomatic corps, and made a city of 100,000 people on mud islands the most powerful commercial state in the Western world has been dissolved by geography and technology and the patient development of alternatives that Venice's competitors had been building for a century. The salt is still there. The pans still evaporate. The crystals still form on the tidal flats of the northern Adriatic, but they are no longer a weapon. They are just salt.